2/3 of the Earth's population lives near the coast. Ancient Egypt is one of the most impressive civilizations ever known. 5,000 years ago, the lands of Egypt were united and linked together by great waterways. The Red Sea and the famous Nile River, two great highways of Egypt.
Since the dawn of history in Egypt and until the early 20th century, the Nile was Egypt's maritime highway. The current flows from south to north, while the wind blows from north to south. The boats were able to sail across the whole stretch of the Nile. Today we have alternatives for transportations, train, planes, trucks, cars, whatever. But in antiquity, there were only boats. My name is Ahmad Khalil. I work as a lecturer for maritime archaeology in the University of Alexandria. Boats were not just for trade, but for all purposes, and they were carrying all things that we can conceivably think of. People traveling, cargoes, live animals, furniture, grain, everything. I mean, the Nile represented to the Egyptians life, basically. It is life to Egyptians.
Somewhere in Egypt's past, drifting rafts evolved into sailing ships that harnessed the river, sea, and wind and enabled the great civilization to be born. Many experts now believe that the key to Egypt's greatness lies not in its pyramids, impressive as they may be, but in its lost shipbuilding technology. The ancient ships and the secrets they hold remain a mystery, yet to be uncovered. Though there are many references to ships in Egyptian writing, there are few known examples of actual ancient ships. Did the ancient Egyptians possess seagoing technology? And how far did they go? In Egypt today, 3 investigators, part of a new movement in nautical Egyptian archaeology, are working to unravel these questions.
A lot of people call me an underwater archaeologist, which makes me laugh because for 20 years, most of my career was in looking at boats that were being dug up in the desert. I'm Cheryl Ward. I'm an associate professor at Florida State University, but my real passion is unraveling the secrets of ancient Egyptian boat builders.
Cheryl has been investigating ancient Egyptian boats for more than 20 years. One of her most recent projects was at Marsa Gowasis, an ancient Egyptian port and staging area for ancient boat builders on the Red Sea. Here, researchers discovered planks that were remnants of 4,000-year-old Egyptian boats. She believes this is strong evidence that the ancient Egyptians did travel long distances by water to the legendary land of Punt, an ancient center of commerce that many believe was located in modern-day Ethiopia or possibly Yemen. Cheryl's fascination with ancient Egyptian boats continues to this day.
The traditional way of building any wooden boat for the last 1,500 years is to first lay the keel, then a skeleton, and on that skeleton, the frames, you just bend your planks. Well, in antiquity, it was all different. My name is Harit Salas. I'm an historian, and I specialize in experimental nautical archaeology. The only reason for me being in Cairo is to build that papyrus boat.
Until 1850 AD, basically every boat in the world was still made out of wood. And it's incredible to say, okay, this is Egyptian, or at least the first evidence we have of it is Egyptian technology, and it lasts for so long. How could something that good have just shown up? I'm Pierce Paul Kreisman, and I'm a nautical archaeologist. Archaeology is part of anthropology because we're studying culture. We happen to be studying material culture, and so the more we learn about the artifacts that are left behind, the more we can tell about the people who left them behind.
Before the middle of the 20th century, most of what was known about ancient Egyptian boats came from two-dimensional drawings that offered little insight into the complexities of these vessels. Ancient boats were associated more with Egyptian religion. Solar or funeral ships were seen in pictoglyphs, ferrying Egyptians and their possessions across great waters, the river Styx, and into the afterlife. Then, that all changed. Just over 50 years ago, in 1954, workers clearing up around the Great Pyramid of Giza made an amazing find. An underground chamber cut out of solid rock was discovered alongside the pyramid. It was excavated and revealed a fine ship of immense proportions, nearly 150 feet long.
We are in the south side of the Great Pyramid, where exists the oldest constructed boat in Egypt, the largest one.
I think the discovery of the Khufu boat really turned people on to the idea of how elaborate the ancient Egyptian ships could be. Although a set of 5 or 6 smaller cedar boats have been found at the site of Dashur in the late 1890s, and there were many, many models and many pictures of boats and carvings everywhere, people really had no sense of the magnificence of these because the Khufu boat is truly extraordinary. All of us are dwarfed when we see it, and the scale of it reminds us all that the pharaohs were truly the living gods of ancient Egypt.
Most of the major discoveries always come by accident, and this is one of them.
The ship had been disassembled into more than 1,000 pieces and locked in a bedrock cavern where it would lie untouched for 45 centuries.
The Khufu barge would have rested down here for almost 4,500 years until it was rediscovered by accident. The seal would have been between the top of the blocks, the massive boulders almost set resting across the top, and the walls themselves, the top of the wall. They started drilling holes in to take a look and see what was there. There were these massive boulders. Imagine just coming across a line of these things. It's kind of like an inverted Stonehenge or something. The curiosity alone must have forced them to dig in a little bit more. But they drilled some holes in and took a peek and discovered that there were organics down here. Once you've exposed organics to the environment, you almost have to excavate them and go ahead and take care of them and conserve them properly.
In one of the most challenging archaeology projects ever undertaken, the ship, known as Khufu's barge, was reassembled in the Cairo Museum. It took more than 14 years. The pieces of boat had ancient symbols inscribed on them, instructions which allowed researchers to piece the boat back together.
One of the things that has always intrigued me about the Egyptian boats, the most magnificent example we have, the ship of Khufu, was taken apart and laid very carefully in layers that correspond to different parts of the boat. The only reason you do something like that is because you're intending to take it apart and be able to put it back together.
So why was Khufu's barge left disassembled in the cavern? The symbols inscribed on the pieces were not intended for museum workers some 4,000 years later. They were inscribed for Khufu himself, who is believed to have been entombed in the adjacent Great Pyramid, so he could reassemble the boat and sail into the afterlife.
A pharaoh getting up after 3,000 years, the first thing he is going to ask after where is my wife or my wives is where is my boat and where are my slippers?
Khufu's boat now sits in a museum adjacent to the Great Pyramid, directly above the pit in which it was found. With the discovery, researchers finally had a real, larger-than-life boat to study. For the first time, investigators could see with their own eyes the massive timbers running the entire length of the boat, intricately interlocked and lashed together. At nearly 150 feet long, it was like nothing anyone had ever imagined. It is also a living example of the genius technology that was lost in nautical evolution. The ancient Egyptians designed their boats to be taken apart and put back together, so they could carry the pieces long distances, from the Nile to the Red Sea, where they would be reassembled and then sailed.
The Khufu barge represents the bulk of what we know about shipbuilding in the Old Kingdom. Yes, there are there's iconography in tombs, there are some other sources, some other artifacts that are very indicative of some of the traits and the uses and construction methods. But by having an artifact itself, especially an artifact this complex, I mean, this tells us a lot about the shipbuilding from the Old Kingdom. The problem is, you have to ask the question, is this method, the method they would use for a solar boat for the pharaoh, the same method they would be using on regular boats in daily life?
Questions only intensified. Were ancient Egyptian boats real seagoing ships? Could they even float? Where did the technology and materials come from? The tools? Why did the technology disappear? The reassembled Khufu's boat is a symbol of the fragments of information that experts and observers have been able to piece together about Egypt's lost shipbuilding technology. Cheryl Ward, Piers Paul Kriesman, and Harry Zallis are investigating the pieces of this great puzzle. Harry Zallis is an expert in nautical recreation. Using 4,000-year-old drawings as a guide, he's about to attempt the recreation of one of the most ancient forms of Egyptian boats to display at Cairo's Pharaonic village.
An ancient image, an ancient representation of a boat is not a blueprint, it's not a construction plan. There are a lot of details that we don't have about the papyrus boats of the Egyptians.
Harry's goal is to be as authentic as possible, but he only has 4 days to do it. On such a tight schedule, he may have to compromise. Piers Paul Kriesman examines the Dashur boats.
The Cairo Dashur boats tell us quite a bit about what happened in Egypt beforehand, in as far as a seafaring mentality goes, and they foretell us about what's going to happen in the Mediterranean until about 500 AD, perhaps even a little bit later.
Did the ancient Egyptians develop seafaring technology that would determine the course of history? Nautical archaeologist Cheryl Ward looks for clues on the streets of historic Alexandria.
The reason I do archaeology is to help show how close we are to the people in the past, to try to explain how similar their lives were to ours, where we think we're very, very different.
She will search modern Egyptian boatyards to find out what, if any, traditions remain. Are they lost forever? Cheryl's journey to Alexandria may help her connect the past and the present, and comes after decades of ancient investigations. Her story begins at her home base here at Florida State University.
I started studying ancient Egyptian boats in 1983. Most of them had already been excavated. I was fortunate enough that by the time that some archaeologists who were working at a pyramid somewhat south of Cairo at a place called Lisht, by the time that they realized that the planks that they were finding around the pyramid, supporting a construction ramps, things like that, by the time they realized those were probably ship planks, I had already been able to study a lot of the excavated boats somewhat. And in doing research, it became quite clear that archaeologists who had worked in Egypt 100 years ago had found similar arrays of planks, similar strange shapes made out of local wood. Those aren't available anymore because the workmen that they had at that time were given them to use as fuel. Things have changed a lot in Egypt, and so now when people do find wood planks in the ground like this, they realize that even though they look a bit like railroad ties, they're big and blocky and they're heavy, they've got these cuts along their edges and maybe some old fastenings in them. The Egyptologists have come to appreciate those as being likely to represent ship timbers or boat timbers. I've had the chance to work with Catherine Bard and Rodolfo Fadovich at Wadi Gwasis on their excavations there, and to see the remains of really frantic activity of cleaning off these boat timbers that had come back on these ships from Punt, and bits of rope everywhere, and fastenings and barnacles, and the cedar timbers being cut up and reused as steps and walkways, which is what happened on the Nile as well, so that was very exciting.
The ancient boats Cheryl studies have been well preserved for thousands of years by the sand they are buried in. 22 ancient boats have been excavated to date, the oldest collection of ancient boats in the world.
One of the things that is always engaging to me about working with the Egyptian boats is that because we have the chance to look at a number of different examples, the boats at Abydos from 3050 to 3000 BC, the Khufu ships at about 2550 BC, the timbers at Lisht from about 1950 BC, the Dashur boats from 1850 BC, the timbers at Wadi Gwasis from then or maybe a couple of 100 or 300 years later. What we get to do is to try to evaluate changes in technology, to try to look to see what our ideas have been in the past and about the origins of wooden shipbuilding and capacities and abilities, especially of the Egyptians, and how those fit up with the reality that's exposed.
Piers Paul Kriesman is part of a new generation of Egyptologists. He works out of Texas A&M's Institute of Nautical Archaeology. It's one of the most renowned institutions of its kind in the world. He has access to technology that could only be dreamed of a generation ago. This is his home base for investigating ancient Egyptian boats, from the most complex mysteries to the simplest questions. His focus is the Dashur boats, discovered near the Dashur pyramids a century ago. They are nearly 4,000 years old.
The fact of the matter was there had been no purely academic and thorough study of the two vessels that still remained in Egypt, in the Cairo Museum. I went through the published record and compiled a bunch of notes and figures and data about what the measurements of the vessel were and tried to rebuild them here in the ship lab. And I found that I couldn't do it with what was published.
Piers Paul needs to see the Dashur boats with his own eyes. His journey takes him nearly 7,000 miles, from College Station, Texas, to just outside of Cairo, Egypt. It was here that the Dashur boats were found in 1895.
This is the plain of Dashur, about 10 to 15 kilometers south of where we're standing now at Saqqara. It was used by the Middle Kingdom pharaohs to build their pyramids in the shadow of the Old Kingdom pharaohs. Just behind the oil processing plant, you can see the pyramid of Senusret III and the surrounding complex, just the lighter color sand. And at the very southernmost end of this is where the Dashur boats were found. Today we have 4 of the vessels, 1 in Pittsburgh, 1 in Chicago, and 2 remain here in Cairo in the Egyptian Museum.
By analyzing the boats up close, Piers Paul is hoping to determine what tools and technologies were used. This could help answer the question, were they actually seaworthy or just props for religious ceremonies of the time? Was there a link to technologies that allowed the Romans to conquer the seas years later? Piers Paul also hopes to create a 3D model of the boats, one that will allow a visual record of what these 4,000-year-old boats once looked like, to better understand how they were used by the civilizations that built them. Harry Zallis from Athens, Greece, is an expert in nautical recreations. He has taken part in recreation projects around the world. Now he will tackle a new challenge. In the next 4 days, he will construct a 9-meter-long papyrus boat in the pharaonic tradition, the ancient ancestor to boats like Khufu's barge and the Dashur boats. Little is known about these vessels, so Harry is basing his construction plan on ancient ship representations. He's on a tight schedule. He only has 4 days to complete one of the largest papyrus boats in the pharaonic tradition ever built. It may not be enough time, and he may have to make some tough choices. He's working on location at Cairo's pharaonic village, an entire town dedicated to recreating ancient Egyptian life. It's a calm and beautiful oasis in the heart of a city of 15 million people. Harry's papyrus boat will remain here, a real-life ancient recreation in a natural setting. And the best part about working at the pharaonic village is that there are plenty of workers for whom building with papyrus comes naturally.
All the people in this area have a relation with the papyrus. You see, it's inside their chromosome to work the papyrus.
Mohammed El Tawab, or Rizal as he is known, has been working with papyrus for decades.
In the water, is it deep?
Victor Siporek is a Canadian boat-building apprentice. He's been handed the opportunity of a lifetime, helping Harry build a 4,000-year-old craft on the banks of the Nile. Together, Victor and Rizal venture into a Nile tributary to search for the papyrus they will need to build the craft.
Over here, big bunch right here.
Papyrus is a thick paper-like material that was found in abundance throughout ancient Egypt. Experts believe Egyptians have been constructing floating rafts with the material since the First Dynasty, some 5,000 years ago. Now Harry has to figure out for himself how they were built. As he arrives, the workers are getting underway with the first layer of papyrus. 2 hours north of Cairo, Alexandria is on the Mediterranean coast. Its ties to the sea go back thousands of years, from the ancient lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, that beckoned mariners more than 2,000 years ago, to a rich shipbuilding heritage that goes back thousands of years before that. Cheryl Ward has been investigating ancient Egyptian boats for more than 2 decades.
I wanted to have the chance to talk to some of the people who have been building ships there for a long time. And so I asked Imad if he could help me to locate some of the older yards in Alexandria.
Cheryl and Imad scour the city, searching for any tools or technologies of ancient Egyptian boat building still in use today. They find a wooden boatyard on the shores of the Mediterranean. It's a modern yard, and visible from the street are luxury boats suited for Europe's rich and famous, and they are all made of wood. They meet the boatyard owner, who may shed some light on the evolution of Egyptian boats since ancient times. Cheryl begins by attempting to determine the origins of the wood.
This is a boat that's built of native Egyptian woods. The planking is made of tamarisk, and then this one is the mulberry. So this is a little boat. It's like a ship's boat, 3 meters. So this is quite large. How many meters is this boat? 23. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people assume that we think of Egypt as being a desert, that there's not very much wood here. In fact, even today, there's a really active shipbuilding industry in Egypt where the fishing boats are built out of local woods like mulberry and tamarisk. And I've seen some of the trunks, and they're immense. They're really huge, and they're building ships that are 25, 30, 40 meters long out of those local woods, even today, when there are tens of millions more people living in the country.
Back in Cairo, Piers Paul Kriesman has arrived at the historic Cairo Museum. He's preparing to examine the 4,000-year-old Dashur boats. The boats are not as well preserved as Khufu's barge.
The boat probably would have been held together by, it's called mortise and tenons, basically a tongue and groove. One piece of wood would sit in the slot right here, and then it would match on a slot on the other timber, and it would be locked together. It would be stopped from moving.
Mortise and tenon is perhaps the most widely used method for craftsmen throughout human history, to join together two pieces of wood. Essentially, a hole is cut in one piece, and the second piece of wood slips into the hole, locking it in place.
Now here's a very good example of a reconstructed mortise in a tenon. It would have locked this timber to this timber. You can see the joint end here.
In addition to mortise and tenon, Piers Paul believes the bow and stern of this vessel may have been lashed together. The evolution from lashing to mortise and tenon was a change in technology that would determine the future of boat building, and evidence that these boats were designed for more than just religious ceremonies.
This is the first example of mortise and tenon, and that technology is pervasive throughout the Mediterranean for basically the next 2,500 years.
Just on the other side of the Nile, nautical recreationist Harry Zallis is at the Pharaonic village, the construction site for his 9-meter-long papyrus boat, an ancient ancestor to Piers Paul's Dashur boats. His Egyptian work crew is constructing the first layer of papyrus. Just on the other side of the Nile, nautical recreationist Harry Zallis is at the Pharaonic village, the construction site for his 30-foot-long papyrus boat. They bundle it together in 30-foot-long stalks, the entire length of the boat, and lash it together tight. Harry's papyrus boat will be one of the largest built in the world since Thor Heyerdahl's Ra 1 and 2 more than 35 years ago. Little is documented about papyrus boats in the Pharaonic tradition, but for Harry, that's all part of the adventure.
There are a lot of questions that are not answered and will probably not be answered. Was there any interior reinforcements? Was there a backbone, some ribs? We don't know.
Harry's first challenge will be to give the boat longitudinal strength, a backbone that will withstand the forces. He's believed this is the missing link, and he'll have to use all his creative juices to come up with a solution. Piers Paul Kriesman from Texas A&M University is in the world-famous Cairo Museum studying the 4,000-year-old Dashur boats. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding all ancient Egyptian boats is the wood. Where did it come from, and how was it used? In the case of the Dashur boats, Piers Paul detects clear signs of what archaeologists refer to as ancient recycling.
It seems like the deck planks were, again, another sign of recycling. This might have been what was left over when they shaved off to make the rest of the timbers. But in the construction on this vessel, you can see how they set in little L-shaped slots in the side in this crosspiece. So they could have been taken out to get to the bottom of the boat. And if the rowers needed some more legroom, which they certainly would have, you can't row with your knees in your chest and your paddle right here. So you take these out, sit on the beams, and then you could row a lot more comfortably and have some more power.
It's clear the Dasher boats were designed to be taken apart and put back together again. The timbers may have been used as substitute planks for other boats, or for something completely different, like furniture.
Here we have probably the best evidence of ancient recycling on this boat. There's 4 or 5 mortises cut into this one timber, all in the same place. It would have made the joint itself very, very weak, so it's probably a sign of having been used over time in other places. This was a boat for a pharaoh. Why have all the timbers been reused? There's something like 85% of all the timbers on this boat show signs of reuse. That's a pretty high number. Tests from the 2 boats in the United States tell us that the wood that these ships were made out of was probably Lebanese cedar. So maybe it's saying that the wood was getting expensive. There was difficulty getting the cedar from Lebanon, or these were important to him during his life, and he wanted to have them for his afterlife.
Ancient Egyptian boats constructed with cedars from far-off Lebanon, strong evidence supporting the ancient Egyptian seagoing capabilities. But how were the massive trees transported? Experts believe that the secret lies in ancient artwork, depicting the 40 great ships of King Snefru from the 4th dynasty. They believe ships like these may have transported wood more than 300 miles across the waters of the Mediterranean. Back at the wooden boatyard, nautical archaeologist Cheryl Ward continues to explore the origins of the wood being used here. She's already found many examples of local Egyptian wood. She now discovers many of the larger vessels use imported wood, just like the ancient Egyptians would have done for the luxury vessels in their day.
Because it's building very high-quality boats, he gets most of his wood from Africa, from Ghana, from Cameroon, from Ivory Coast. These are different sorts of tropical hardwoods, mahoganies, basically. So he's going outside to get durable woods. The pharaohs, however, they wanted to build a ship of this size and of this caliber. They had the ability to go and get the longer timbers of conifers like cedar of Lebanon at places like the coast of Lebanon, maybe Cyprus, but mostly we think they went to Lebanon. And they were doing that as early as about 2600 BC, probably a little earlier because we get some hints of cedar showing up before then.
But long before the ancient Egyptians built with wood, they developed their tools and skills with papyrus. And back in the Pharaonic village, Harry Zallis and his team are preparing to tackle the greatest hurdle in their recreation. How should they give the papyrus boat the longitudinal strength it requires to take it on the Nile? Harry believes the interior keel is the missing link. In his estimation, it would have resembled one long, thick timber running the entire length of the boat. Like 4,000 years ago, 25-foot-long timbers are not so abundant in Egypt, so they will have to compromise by piecing modern lumber together. Apprentice Victor Siporek hammers in a modern-day nail. Harry is unhappy that the modern realities of budget and schedule require the use of some very un-ancient materials.
We're talking of a period before metals, and if ever nails would be used, it would be 3 nails of wood. I could build an intricate system of mortise and tenons that would be near to what the ancient Egyptians used, even for their furniture. But that is time-consuming, because we don't have time enormous at our disposal. We are using nails, but I'm not happy with that.
The backbone, now in one long piece, heads to the carpenter shop to have the rib grooves carved out. Meanwhile, Cheryl Ward has found a carpenter shop of her own in Alexandria. She's meeting shipbuilders constructing modern Egyptian wooden boats, and examines the tools of their trade.
He uses this as a sander. This is very interesting. He's kind of taking a very fine blade as a way to smooth it. So he uses a saw. This is a pull saw, just like the ancient Egyptians used. It's very efficient to pull the saw towards you. In the West, mostly we use push saws. Oh, this is just beautiful. This is an adze. It's a classic shipbuilding tool. It's got a very sharp blade here. And we see these in ancient Egypt from the earliest copper tools and the models of copper tools that were buried with the kings. They included an adze. This one's been used for decades, I would imagine. What he's doing here is using the adze in the very difficult place to reach. And of course, this is the most difficult place any shipwright ever has to deal with. It's the seam between the keel and the garboard. It's the devil. And that's where the saying between the devil and the deep blue sea is this is the most vulnerable place that you can imagine having the seal against the water. So they're still using an ancient method and technique, even if the Egyptians didn't use this exact approach. It's the same idea.
But of course, there are larger, more powerful tools in this modern boatyard.
Carpenters, like shipbuilders, have certain jobs they have to do, and they use the tools they're comfortable with. And in some cases, we can see the same tradition stretching back through 5,000 years.
Back at the pharaonic village, Harry Zallis explores 4,000-year-old construction techniques as he tries to create the longitudinal support for his papyrus boat. He heads to inspect the crew's first attempt at a longitudinal support structure. He does not like what he sees. Harry explains to Razel that the backbone was cut incorrectly, and as a result, will weaken the joints.
They have messed the scarves.
It's not possible to put another layer.
Victor suggests reinforcing the backbone with another layer of planking.
We don't want to mend it.
Harry is not receptive to the idea.
You know, first thing, too many people went, and I was the one giving the instruction, and I was left behind, and everybody happily went and brought things completely different from my instructions.
No, they did exactly your instructions.
No. They are no.
Joints ended on.
No. They just cut it on the wrong side. You saw it. Well, if you consider it's all right, continue build the boat. I mean, it's all right. It's not all right. You agree? You know, I'm not here to contradict someone nor to be contradicted. I want to build a damn boat which is built for the first time. So I don't want to have people giving ideas. I mean, that's what it is, and they have to follow my instructions. And that's it. And I want to have it correctly done. I don't want mended pieces of wood. And I mean, that is wrong.
Once tensions ease, Victor and the team head back to try again. Harry encourages the builders to think in the past.
Builders want to be in the 21st century. They don't want you to take them 4,000 years back. So they want to use the new methods and so on. So it is up to the archaeologist who gets the information to try and understand what is authentic, what is conjectural, and what is just possible.
Everyone holds their breath as Harry returns to make another inspection.
Bravo, Jorgen.
And this time, it's good. On the Mediterranean coast, Cheryl Ward and Imad Khalil continue their journey. It's clear to them that Alexandria is the heart of Egyptian boat building, past and present.
This is the main boat building place in Egypt. It has been like this since antiquity, since the foundation of the city, basically. We have historical evidence that Hellenistic Greek fleets were made in Alexandria, and Roman ships were built in Alexandria, and the Arabs, when they came in, they used Alexandria as the main shipbuilding place, and since then it has been the capital of shipbuilding in Egypt. Yeah.
Well, and it's an easy point of access for the wood to come in, and also for the boats to be traded out. Alexandria has been such an important port for thousands of years. I don't think we could ever really say that any boat building industry ever dies out, because there's always somebody somewhere building a boat in their backyard, if nothing else, especially when you live by the sea.
Because the need of a boat would never stop. You'd always have to either travel or fight or fish or just go and have a nice time on a boat. These are all necessities that keeps boat building going.
At the Pharaonic Village, the biggest hurdle for Harry and his team has been the design of a wooden backbone for the craft. Working from 4,000-year-old sketches isn't easy, and he's had to compromise. But he's finally happy with the design, and the crew gets to work, first laying the backbone, and then the perpendicular ribs.
I'm happy and I'm not worrying anymore, because the backbone of that boat is what we have placed now. It's like the foundation of a body. You need that vertebral column to put the flesh on it. The papyrus is the flesh.
The next step is the second layer of papyrus.
Everything that is a prototype is exciting because you have questions. If we had the answers, we would not have to build the boat.
Will Harry's creation be strong enough? He inspects the second layer of papyrus.
Oh, it's very strong. I mean, I think the 80% of the work has been done. Really, we can get now Gazella do whatever he knows. The papyrus has to be wet, has to become soaked, so they will be able to do that delicate curvature which we see on all the ancient pharaonic painting.
2 hours to the north, Cheryl Ward continues her investigation in Alexandria, looking for more connections between the boatyards of today and those of ancient Egyptian times. She's already located common tools that were used, and now she looks for insight from the minds of the shipbuilders themselves. Mohammed Ali El-Dowi is a 4th-generation shipwright. His family has worked here in Alexandria for hundreds of years.
Is he the person who designs the boats, and does he use ship lines and drawings? Oh, he does everything. So this is just like any ancient shipwright. They know how long. The owner says, I want a ship this long, and then he creates it in the way that he knows will work.
Mohammed communicates his designs to his team with the simplest of methods. Up until the advent of modern computer design programs, the molding board was a universal tool. He simply draws the lines for one side of a ship, and since boats are symmetrical, the opposite side will be the same. There is no need for angles and curves, just the creative mind of the shipbuilder. Simple, but very precise. It is perhaps the most important part of the entire process.
Listening to Hamdi talk about his pride he has had of being a shipwright and shipbuilder, working here since he was 11 years old, starting with the hammer and getting to the point where he can just see with his eye the shapes it should be, start at one end or the other end. His expertise is really amazing.
So how are Mohammed's modern designs different from ancient Egyptian boats? The secret lies in the exterior keel and the framing. Ancient boats had no keel, and like Khufu's barge, the dasher boats, and even ancient papyrus rafts, the boats were constructed with incredibly long beams, or bundles of papyrus, all specifically cut to fit with the other, and joined with the ancient mortise and tenon technology, or lashing.
I've talked to the boat builders in several shipyards here in Egypt. They're astounded at the idea that you would build a ship inside out in their way of thinking, that you could rely on the planking to hold the ship together. And this is true not just in Egypt, but I think anytime we work with a modern shipbuilder. The exception is in the Indian Ocean, where a lot of those ships still are shell-built. And they have a little bit more framing than we're used to in Egypt and the Mediterranean, but they're still very much shell-built. So they understand the concept. But here in Egypt, they've been building in the modern way for more than 1,500 years.
Cheryl and Imad wrap up their investigation of the modern boatyards. In their search for links to ancient Egyptian boat construction, they have seen echoes of the past, in the tools, sources of wood, and in some cases, the mindset of the shipwright, bearing a striking similarity to more ancient times. Back at the Cairo Museum, Piers Paul is stepping back 4 millennia and attempting to create a digital 3D model of what the 4,000-year-old Dahshur boats would have looked like when they set sail, if they set sail.
And as section 1.1 comes out to 30 centimeters, what I have here is a digital goniometer. Basically, it just measures angles from over a known distance. As long as I'm on one of my baselines here, I can take this measurement. So I hold the button, and it gives me 55 degrees. And do this for all the points I want on the boat. I can then put them all in the computer and try and build some three-dimensional structures and use these lines to reconstruct the plans like an architect would for a building. The 138 by 31, and then a couple of other bits of information that identify the specific place and timber I was working with. And so I took these data points and now I can map them out in a 3D space with this green line representing my baseline, the central point from which I'll map everything. I can take this, it's kind of a frame, a skeleton of the boat, plug it in a couple other places, add a little bit in, and dress it up, and get something a little bit like this. This is a 3D representation of what I think the boats would have looked like with all their dressings. Before they went into the ground to go with the pharaoh into the afterlife, all the boat models that we have, Mekhet Ray and other things, they give us some indication of the way the paint and the pigment would have been built up. And it tells us this is about the best estimate of what they might have looked like without the finer details.
It's an incredible step, from the ruins of an ancient boat to a 3D model that Piers Paul can use as an interactive multimedia presentation to teach others the secrets of these incredible vessels. But were these boats just ceremonial relics? Or would the Dahshur boats actually have been capable of transporting an Egyptian pharaoh on water?
This boat would have been functional on the Nile. It's pretty safe to say that if all the timber were in its original condition, yes, it would have floated. Could it have handled the open seas? Probably not. It's just not hefty enough for that. There's something missing to make it a seafaring boat, but it would have been miraculous on the Nile. It really would have gotten the job done.
Back at the pharaonic village, Harry Zallis and his team prepare for a modern-day journey on the Nile in a craft even more ancient than Piers Paul's Dahshur boats. But first, they must finish building it. With the structure mostly complete, the team must now make the papyrus boat look like an ancient boat.
Very nice. Okay. Enough.
They start by curving the bow and stern of the craft. First, they are wet, then bent and finally tied into shape. While the team works at this, Harry has a plan of his own, the finishing touch for his dream of many years.
People in antiquity were conscious of beauty, which is not always the case today. So, as a decoration, we are going to have the flower of the papyrus.
Piers Paul has completed his investigation of the 4,000-year-old Dahshur boats and has now returned to the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M University. He believes the technology found on these vessels is proof that the ancient Egyptians had seagoing capabilities, and that this same technology would allow the Greeks and Romans to conquer the Mediterranean and much of Europe.
This type of technology, the deep mortise and tenon, as soon as you put a peg through the middle of it and lock it in place, I mean, this isn't going anywhere if you have two planks together. So you're supporting the boat longitudinally and laterally once you put a peg in the middle of it. That's all it takes. This is the earliest use of that as a construction technique that we've found anywhere in the world. This technology is used throughout the Mediterranean until about 500 AD, perhaps even a little bit later, as one of the primary fastening methods for ships and boats. So it really allowed the Romans, and specifically the Greeks, to dominate the seas. It's one of these technologies that without it, we don't know how it would have turned out.
The technology of ancient Egyptian boats led to seafaring domination. But how would boats like those found at Dashur have fared on the open seas?
They were building fairly robust craft to work in a calm environment, which means they're probably using a combination of technologies for seafaring and Nile going. This technology, beefed up a little bit more, very likely could have worked on the open seas. It's probably been used in the Red Sea. Evidence is coming out that this similar technology was probably being used on the Red Sea to go to Yemen and places of that nature, and certainly in the Mediterranean.
At the Pharaonic village, Harry Zallis and his team are all nerves. The boat is ready, and they've tried to move it in a traditional manner. But they just don't have the manpower to move this unstable 2-ton papyrus raft. It looks as though Harry will be forced to make his greatest compromise yet: horsepower over manpower. They start by building a wooden frame, run a rope from bow to stern to hold the ends up, then plan to attach cables to a crane and lift.
You know, a boat is not meant to be on dry land. And moving a boat on dry land, any boat, is a hazard always. You may break something, and it's a little tricky, 30 meters we have to do. It's not much, but still.
The operation begins. Harry looks on nervously.
They have to do it very slowly. I mean, that's the whole thing about it.
As the crane begins to lift, it seems as though everyone's worst fears may come true. The bow and stern sections begin to sag dangerously. Will the longitudinal support, the backbone, be strong enough?
Well, I pity the boat. I mean, the boat is suffering, but I hope it will be sitting soon on its natural surrounding, the water.
This is kind of too bad in some ways, in that after building the boat we didn't really think about transporting it. It was said it would happen in the end. And it looks like we might have broken our keel. Oh, Harry almost got knocked in the canal, but not quite.
Only a few more feet now. Harry can sense triumph, but carrying it through the trees is one thing. Will it float is something completely different. Papyrus boat, based on a 4,000-year-old design, appears to be floating safely on one of the Nile tributaries in downtown Cairo.
It's as good as I hoped it would be. It had reached the maximum of what I expected, so I'm very happy.
The evolution of Egyptian sailing ships begins 4,000 years ago with papyrus boats, and continues to the modern shipyards of Alexandria. By examining ancient technologies, investigators can see the developments that allowed the ancient Egyptians to explore the Nile, Red Sea, and beyond, and the innovations that would be passed on to future civilizations, and ultimately change the world. On the Great Pyramid of Giza made an amazing find. An underground chamber cut out of solid rock was discovered alongside the pyramid. It was excavated and revealed a fine ship of immense proportions, nearly 150 feet long.
We are in the south side of the Great Pyramid, where exists the oldest constructed boat in Egypt, the largest one.
I think the discovery of the Khufu boat really turned people on to the idea of how elaborate the ancient Egyptian ships could be. Although a set of 5 or 6 smaller cedar boats have been found at the site of Dashur in the late 1890s, and there were many, many models and many pictures of boats and carvings everywhere, People really had no sense of the magnificence of these because the Khufu boat is truly extraordinary. All of us are dwarfed when we see it, and the scale of it reminds us all that the pharaohs were truly the living gods of ancient Egypt.
Most of the major discoveries always come by accident, and this is one of them.
To the Egyptians, life basically, it is life to Egyptians.
Somewhere in Egypt's past, drifting rafts evolved into sailing ships that harnessed the river, sea, and wind and enabled the great civilization to be born. Many experts now believe that the key to Egypt's greatness lies not in its pyramids, impressive as they may be, but in its lost shipbuilding technology. The ancient ships and the secrets they hold remain a mystery, yet to be uncovered. Though there are many references to ships in Egyptian writing, there are few known examples of actual ancient ships. Did the ancient Egyptians possess seagoing technology? And how far did they go? In Egypt today, 3 investigators, part of a new movement in nautical Egyptian archaeology, are working to unravel these questions.
A lot of people call me an underwater archaeologist, which makes me laugh because for 20 years, most of my career was in looking at boats that were being dug up in the desert. I'm Cheryl Ward. I'm an associate professor at Florida State University, but my real passion is unraveling the secrets of ancient Egyptian boat builders.
Cheryl has been investigating ancient Egyptian boats for more than 20 years. One of her most recent projects was at Marsa Gowasis, an ancient Egyptian port and staging area for ancient boat builders on the Red Sea. Here, researchers discovered planks that were remnants of 4,000-year-old Egyptian boats. She believes this is strong evidence that the ancient Egyptians did travel long distances by water to the legendary land of Punt, an ancient center of commerce that many believe was located in modern-day Ethiopia or possibly Yemen. Cheryl's fascination with ancient Egyptian boats continues to this day.
The traditional way of building any wooden boat for the last 1,500 years is to first lay the keel, then a skeleton, and on that skeleton, the frames, you just bend your planks. Well, in antiquity, it was all different.
My name is Harit Salas. I'm an historian, and I specialize in experimental nautical archaeology.
The only reason
2/3 of the Earth's population lives near the coast. Ancient Egypt is one of the most impressive civilizations ever known. 5,000 years ago, the lands of Egypt were united and linked together by great waterways. The Red Sea and the famous Nile River, 2 great highways of Egypt.
Since the dawn of history in Egypt and until the early 20th century, the Nile was Egypt's maritime highway. The current flows from south to north, while the wind blows from north to south. The boats were able to sail across the whole stretch of the Nile. Today we have alternatives for transportations, train, planes, trucks, cars, whatever. But in antiquity, there were only boats. My name is Ahmad Khalil. I work as a lecturer for maritime archaeology at the University of Alexandria. Boats were not just for trade, but for all purposes, and they were carrying all things that we can conceivably think of. People traveling, cargoes, live animals, furniture, grain, everything. I mean, the Nile represents
for me, being in Cairo is to build that papyrus boat.
Until 1850 AD, basically every boat in the world was still made out of wood. And it's incredible to say, okay, this is Egyptian, or at least the first evidence we have of it is Egyptian technology, and it lasts for so long. How could something that good have just shown up? I'm Piers Paul Kriesman, and I'm a nautical archaeologist. Archaeology is part of anthropology because we're studying culture. We happen to be studying material culture, and so the more we learn about the artifacts that are left behind, the more we can tell about the people who left them behind.
Before the middle of the 20th century, most of what was known about ancient Egyptian boats came from 2-dimensional drawings that offered little insight into the complexities of these vessels. Ancient boats were associated more with Egyptian religion. Solar or funeral ships were seen in pictoglyphs, ferrying Egyptians and their possessions across great waters, the river Styx, and into the afterlife. Then, that all changed. Just over 50 years ago, in 1954, workers clearing up around